related question, and we got one on this, so I'm going to ask it. You proposed something called the Anti-Corruption and Public Integrity Act.
Yes.
Which I imagine would probably touch the Trump family, which is why I connected the dots. But let me ask you about this idea of lobbyists and people who work in industry and their ability to work in government and then their ability to work in industry.
I think it's called the revolving door.
Yes. Is there any value that you see, because you've made a very big deal of this, is there any value you see in the expertise of somebody, not necessarily a lobbyist, but somebody in industry coming into work in the government in some regulatory capacity? Is that a bad thing?
Of course not. I hired people when I set up the CFPB who had worked in industry. I had put my money, or sorry, your money, where my mouth is on this. I have hired people from industry because they have expertise. But let's pause here for a minute. Expertise and public service. Expertise and some indication that they really do want to work in the public interest. What I object to are when people have only experience working on, say, Wall Street, and they want to move into government for a short period of time and regulate their former and soon-to-be future employer and then zip back through. Gary Cohn. Can we talk Gary Cohn?
Let's talk about Gary Cohn.
Let's talk Gary Cohn. Okay, so Gary Cohn works at Goldman all those years, then moves over to the Trump administration. He's going to have exactly one thing in his portfolio, and that is cram through a new tax law, right? Drive through a new tax law. So what does Goldman Sachs do for Gary Cohn on the way out the door? They hand over somewhere in the neighborhood of $250 million to Gary Cohn in money they didn't have to release. And, you know, you might reasonably ask, would they have done that if he'd done Teach for America? If he'd said, I'm going to go write the great American novel, would they have done that? You know, I just kind of have a doubt about that. But so here's the deal. Gary Cohn, I think of this kind of money as you leave Wall Street to go into government.
According to Bob Woodward, he saved America by taking that paper off of the president's desk.
There you go. I think of it as that money as a pre-bribe. So Gary Cohn picks up these sacks full of money, goes into government, and rewrites the tax laws, manages to cram it through, and boy, did Goldman once again show. Savvy investor. In the first quarter, the tax breaks that Cohn pushed through saved Goldman Sachs more than $250 million. And now it will be the gift that keeps on giving. And here's the deal. Think how that feels to the American people. Think how that feels to somebody who gets out there and, you know, busts her tail and works 40 hours a week and picks up another 6 hours doing part-time work. And she looks up and says, so let me understand this. This guy works at Goldman, he gets $250 million, and then I just want to understand, when he's drawing a paycheck from the American people, is he actually working for us, or is he still working for Goldman, or just working for himself?
Let me ask you, do you genuinely believe that Gary Cohn was making tax policy on behalf of Goldman Sachs? You may have the answer. No.
You asked me what I believe.
Yes.
So this goes back to this question. You asked me about expertise. Gary Cohn's worldview, as best we could tell from the outside, I am not his psychiatrist, but as best we can tell from the outside, is Goldman Sachs. And he comes straight from Goldman Sachs. He doesn't make a detour through Teach for America.
Correct.
He comes straight from Goldman Sachs into government to write tax laws that will affect Goldman Sachs.
100%.
And
I'm not suggesting his worldview is not completely built by his experience at Goldman Sachs.
Then what is your question?
Well, no, but the question is whether you think that he came to Washington to do the bidding of Goldman. And that was the entire purpose of his tour here in Washington.
Look, All I know is he sees the world from, as best I can tell,
right.
from the perspective of Goldman Sachs. And what's good for Goldman Sachs, right, is good. And let me just be clear, whatever, I don't have to peer into his brain. I see what he did. What he did was help Goldman Sachs. And what it means to somebody else out there who's working her tail off and doesn't have that kind of opportunity, who looks at a tax bill that gave away $1.5 trillion to giant corporations and to billionaires and says, wait a minute, I didn't get that. I didn't have the chance to go into government and write the rules to say, hey, let's help people who live in the house I live in. Instead, that all went to Gary Cohn. Gary Cohn, who's sitting on $250 million courtesy of Goldman Sachs. I think if that lady who's working hard every day is a little skeptical about Gary Cohn's judgment under those circumstances, that's pretty fair.